You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Last month, a regional court in Germany took action after police were alerted by a doctor who treated a 4-year-old son of first-generation Turkish immigrants for bleeding after the boy underwent circumcision. The Cologne court ruled that the removal of the boy's foreskin amounted to bodily harm and involved intolerable health risks, ruling that ritual circumcision constituted a violation of physical integrity and was illegal. However, German Chancellor Angela Merkel issued a quick response assuring Jews and Muslims that the practice would be allowed to continue without punishment, and a cross-party motion was quickly passed to protect religious circumcision. Joining me in the Voice of Russia studios in London to discuss the decision by the court in Cologne is Glen Poole, Strategic Director of the Men's Network in Brighton and Hove, an organisation campaigning to end circumcision in the UK. Rabbi Levy of Alyth, Northwestern Reform Synagogue in Golders Green, London. Professor David Katz, the Governor of the Brit Milah Group at the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And Dr. Antony Lempert is on the telephone, who's the chair of the Secular Medical Forum. And we're joined by the Chief Rabbi of Russia, Berl Lazar, in Moscow. What implications does a ruling like this in Cologne have? Rabbi Levy from Alyth.
One is that it really does raise for ethnic groups which have circumcision as part of their practice, religious groups that have circumcision as part of their practice, real questions about how we exist within secular society and whether or not secular society can value those things that we consider to be part of our practice. For Jews, it also does something else, which is it also places us into other time periods. So other groups that have prohibited circumcision, going all the way back to the Hadrianic persecutions of the Roman era. And it therefore pains us. And I think one of the things we need to recognise is that when rulings like this happen, they cause us pain.
Glen Poole, what implications, good or bad, do you feel a ruling like this in Cologne has?
The reason that we, the Men's Network, are opposed to a medically unnecessary male circumcision is that it's a painful and dangerous practice that in the most extreme cases can actually cause the death of babies. And what the ruling in Germany demonstrates is this is a problem that's not going to go away. We're going to keep trying to solve this problem for as long as this practice continues to cause pain, damage and death to babies in the UK and across Europe and around the world. It may come from a legal perspective, it may come from a political perspective, it may come from a social perspective, but countries across Europe and individuals across Europe and organisations across Europe, this issue will not go away. They will continue to campaign for change. And campaign for change is coming not just from outside of the Jewish and Muslim and other circumcising communities, it's also coming now from within those communities. So it raises an issue that won't go away, basically.
Rabbi Lazar in Moscow, could you tell us what an implication of such a ruling in Cologne on this has for Russia?
I don't think the ruling will have much to do within the Jewish community. I believe that circumcisions were done always in all times in the Jewish community, and having done underground is actually going to bring more harm. People are not going to refrain from doing it.
I'm going to ask Professor Katz now what your thoughts on an implication like this in a court in Cologne has.
First of all, one has to view this with a degree of proportionality. This is a district court in Cologne. It's hardly a international movement. It's hardly a pan-European movement. It's one court making one decision in relationship to one set of circumstances. That's number one. Number two, the right of Jews or Muslims, but the right of Jews is where I have expertise, to perform circumcision is respected as a religious and cultural obligation of Jews, and it's accepted as such. And where I do agree with Rabbi Lazar completely is that we, the Jewish community, have adopted all sorts of practices in relationship to sterile procedures and in relationship to the way circumcision is done over the centuries. We've adopted these practices on the basis of good medical evidence, but it remains an obligation, a religious obligation and an important religious obligation. So he is correct that the important issue is how it's best practiced, and possibly persuading Muslims that 4-year-olds in the way this particular circumcision done might not be the right thing to do. Converting that into a general rule, which is what the Cologne judge appears to have tried to do, seems to us to be inappropriate.
Dr. Lempert, to include you now in the discussion, what's your thoughts on this ruling by the Cologne judge?
The first thought is what is the ruling itself, what it is and what it isn't. And what it isn't is banning all forms of circumcision. What it's putting an end to is banning non-medical circumcisions, so circumcisions that have no basis in a medical reason for doing an operation on the normal genitals of a normal child. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about operating on a normal child. The ruling itself, I believe, and many of us believe, places in Cologne is one of potentially many that will come, because it places it in its proper safeguarding children context. I work as a GP. I also work in child protection, and really our focus is very much on what children need, not necessarily, not always what parents need. Of course, the two will often come together, but quite often they don't. There are situations, particularly in religious contexts, where parents will often seek to do something or prevent something happening to a child which is not in the child's best interests. I take, for example, the situation of a child born to Jehovah's Witness parents, for example. The parents are perfectly entitled to refuse a life-saving transfusion for themselves, but certainly the courts in the UK have ruled that parents don't have the right to impose this sort of harm on their child. And make no mistake, I mean, this is not an isolated comment from Europe. The Royal Dutch Medical Association 2 years ago, along with 7 of the major associations in Holland, including the GPs, the urologists, the paediatric surgeons, all stated that non-therapeutic child circumcision is a violation of a boy's rights to autonomy and to physical integrity, and I would go along with that.
Rabbi Levy.
I think one of the things we need to recognise is that necessity is subjective. If we define anything that isn't medical as being unnecessary, then we place ourselves in some very interesting positions in terms of things that we're prepared to accept within society. If we say that cultural reasons, religious reasons aren't of value in society, then of course we're going to say that something like circumcision for cultural religious reasons is problematic. I happen to believe that cultural and religious reasons are important, that actually we do things to our bodies for far more trivial reasons, be they aesthetic or hedonistic or whatever it might be, and that actually there is a value in this practice. Now, if the conversation we're going to have is a conversation about risk and how do we minimise risk when we do that, then I think that's a very valuable conversation and one that we would be well advised to go into. And Professor Katz has already indicated that the Jewish community has been quite proactive in going into that conversation. But if this is a blanket conversation about whether or not cultural and religious practices have value, then actually we're not going to get anywhere.
What we're asking actually is what implication this decision in a court in Cologne has. And obviously Professor Katz says we need to put it in perspective. But nevertheless, it has put the discussion up on the agenda.
What we're not dealing with in the UK is the fact that this practice is performed without anaesthetic. About 500,000 boys under the age of 16 are at risk of being circumcised before the age of 16. It causes pain, it causes risk. And there have been deaths. The most recent death in the northwest of London after a circumcision performed by a rabbi in February led to a 1-month-old baby boy bleeding to death. A study done in 2009 in Oxford found that 45% of all circumcisions performed in an Islamic school were essentially botched and led to complications. And even in the medical world, we know that in the hospital in Birmingham, we have 1 child a month being admitted into paediatric intensive care with complications, and 100 babies every single year in that one hospital being admitted to A&E. So there's a real issue here with this practice, and we are opposed. Personally, I'm opposed, and I'm hearing a lot of other people opposed, a lot of parents, actually from within your community, opposed to subjecting children to that kind of pain and that kind of risk for what is a parent's choice, not a child's choice. And you're right, we do lots of things to our body. I do lots of things to my body that aren't necessarily good for my body. And what we do to another person's body is a completely different matter. And there's no consent here, and that's really important. And there's also the hypocrisy of the fact we have legislation that prevents us doing far lesser surgeries on girls in the UK and around the world, and yet, for cultural reasons, and yet we don't protect boys and don't give boys the same protection. And that position is not tenable, so it's not going to go away. So it's great that we're having these kind of conversations. It's great to see the Jewish community coming forward and having these conversations with us. It's an issue that won't go away because there is a movement across the world that's actually saying this is an issue that needs to be addressed. Doing nothing is not an option. And when baby boys bleed to death in our country, doing nothing is not an option.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Professor Katz.
Of course, baby boys bleeding to death is not acceptable. The way around that may be to actually improve the quality of circumcision, not to ban it. To improve the way it's done, to improve the way it's regulated, not to ban it. You don't ban things because they're done badly or done incorrectly. You actually have a look and see how you can improve them. That's number one. Number two, you've raised the question of lesser surgery on females. I don't know what you're referring to, what the lesser surgery on females is, but I'm presuming if it's lesser surgery, it's not referring to the female genital mutilation debate. It's referring to ear piercing.
No, it's female genital mutilation.
I don't think, with respect, that anybody would say that female genital mutilation is lesser surgery.
Sometimes it's nicking and piercings. It's a broad range of practices, so it's different from, but in some cases worse than male circumcision.
Well, in some cases it's worse, is what you said now.
Yes,
you said it was lesser.
I said some practices within FGM are actually lesser than male circumcision, not all.
The question is, really, comes back to my point of view about religion, and my point of view about religion and culture. And there's a religious issue. There's also a cultural issue. This took place in Germany, and one has to recognize that the whole subject of consent in medical ethics has really arisen out of the problems that happened in Germany. We didn't have discussion about consent until 60 years ago. And so this whole question of consent is a new issue, and amongst the Jewish circumcision practitioners in the UK, yes, they get parental consent. And parental consent is what is needed for procedures on children. With regard to the question of religious versus secular, however, I don't know what your beliefs are. I don't know what anybody else's official beliefs are or unofficial beliefs in this group. But I have to say that I do regard, inverted commas, secular beliefs as giving you a different worldview to religious beliefs. And if one's talking from a secular belief, of course you're going to say anything that religious practices follow is not acceptable. That's part of the secular belief structure. We have a different belief structure.
I'd just like to take Professor Katz up on a couple of issues. Perhaps the last one he mentioned first of all, the question about attributing motives to secularism. What secularism essentially means is that no one belief system should have a prejudicial impact upon the decision-making process or on practice. They shouldn't be given special privileges. And in fact, what we find with the practice of circumcision is that that's precisely what does happen, is that Jewish and Muslim groups, simply by virtue of being adult Jews and adult Muslims, are given a very privileged position to do things to their children. Professor Katz mentioned parental consent. He said that's all that's necessary for parents to do things to their children. I'm afraid he's fundamentally wrong there. What's necessary is that parents have absolute responsibilities to look after their children. Society has a duty to intervene when parents are planning to do some harm to their children. But I do also wonder whether we're talking a bit at cross purposes here, particularly in terms of the cultural aspects. You see, I have no problem whatsoever. As a secularist, I personally think live and let live. Absolutely, I will not interfere with other autonomous people's decisions, how to practice their beliefs, or as long as it doesn't interfere with other people. And I can really see why many adult Jewish men who seem happy that they've lost what perhaps would have been the most sensitive part of their penis feel threatened and are telling me not to interfere because it's their penis and they're happy with it. And were it an adult choice, were it things that we do to our own bodies, as Rabbi Levy said, then believe me, I wouldn't meddle. But this is a very egocentric worldview. There's a massive disenfranchised group out there, those adults who were born to Jewish or Muslim parents who don't agree with the practice and whose own penises were interfered with for reasons they don't agree with. So that, and the difficulty is these people are not being listened to. Their views are not being given worth. They're not being given value. In fact, many of them feel quite worthless within their communities because actually the community, these adult, it's a bit like tattooing someone with the word communist on their forehead and then only asking adult communists whether they were happy with that having been done to them. The people who are not being asked in this debate are people from within those communities who either still believe and wish to change their practice, as Glen said, there are many of them, or who have moved away from that religion, that culture, and who simply didn't want this incredible invasion of the most personal, private part of their body to have happened because of somebody else's beliefs. I mean, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about interfering with reasonable cultural choices. We're talking about other people imposing, branding. I mean, that's literally what it is. This is branding a child as part of a culture according to their parents. And that's simply not okay within safeguarding contexts.
Rabbi Levy.
Is this a question of whether or not a minor neonatal operation can be performed on a child by parents without a child's consent for cultural or religious reasons? Is that a legitimate reason to do that procedure? I would suggest that there is a right for parents to raise their children within a cultural group, to respond positively to what they consider to be their religious obligations, and that there is something very problematic about challenging that from an entirely secular position. But that seems to be a different question to the question that Glen is raising, which I think is probably one that we really ought to be dealing with together, which is how do we ensure that this is done in a way which minimises risk? Clearly the way to minimise risk completely is to stop it happening at all, but I don't think that's either likely or particularly helpful response. But how can we minimise risk? And certainly within parts of the Reformed Jewish world, there have been large steps taken towards minimising risk. All of our Moalim, all of the people who do circumcisions in our part of the Jewish world are doctors. Most of them use stitches rather than packing. They provide very significant aftercare. Where there are non-neonatal procedures, they're almost always carried out by surgeons. Now, there are religious problems with that for other parts of the Jewish world. But what they are is a response to some of those concerns that Glen has raised for us. And I think if we can keep the conversation on that level, which is how do we minimise risk together? How do we respond positively to the fact that there are challenges of doing the procedure, then we might get somewhere. If what we have is a point-blank refusal to recognise that this is something that parents have any right to do to their kids, as Antony's suggesting, then I'm not sure we can really move on together because we're talking at completely cross purposes.
Glen, do you still stand from a point of view that it should not happen at all?
I think there's three key things that I'd like to see happen. One is the reduction of harm, and it's good to hear certain communities that do circumcise are taking that seriously. One is regulation. It's good to hear that case raised, and it's not regulated properly in the UK at the moment. We don't know how many circumcisions are performed and who's performing them and where they're being performed. I had an example of a baby in Bristol having its skull fractured when it fell off a kitchen table. That's not regulation.
Can I just say, that's such an odd example to give because no one ever had their skull fractured from having the tip of their penis cut off. I mean,
the baby in Bristol did.
That's an issue of care by the parents in the performance
and lack of regulation.
And it's a very I'm not sure it's a great example. I think it kind of demeans your case a bit.
It doesn't demean my case. It's what's actually happening in our example. It's what's happening in our communities. So that's why we need to take it seriously. That's why we can't just back away from having these conversations because people have different viewpoints. We have to take it seriously.
No one's saying not to take it seriously, but it's rather equivalent to saying let's ban the use of hammers because someone fell off a ladder once. It's not a. I have a great deal of sympathy for a lot of what you're saying, but I think that is a particularly unhelpful example.
Well, you don't want to hear it, do you?
No, it's not that I don't want to hear it. I just think it's a particularly unhelpful example.
Which, can I make the third point? There was a third point, though.
Sure, sorry.
It's okay. The third point is then legal reform. Now, we know from female genital mutilation that changing the law doesn't stop the practice, and there's a real issue. There's Somali communities that have gone to the medical practice and said, we want to nick the genitals of girls symbolically in a safe medical way because it's our cultural practice. Can you please help us do that? And the medical profession has said, no, there's no way, absolute zero tolerance. So when we get into the area of tolerating the practice for boys, we also get into the area of why do we not then tolerate the practice for girls? Now, I say whatever the law is, it should be equal, and my position is there should be no tolerance of the practice of medically unnecessary surgery on girls or boys' genitals. So I stand in the place of reform as well as reducing harm and regulating.
Professor Katz, is there any middle ground you hear here?
I think I've made clear that there is a middle ground in sense of regulation. I don't think it's particularly helpful to make distinctions between bits of the Jewish community, and I don't think it's particularly helpful to say that this is a practice that is always done by doctors. There are lots of procedures today that used to be done by doctors and are done by others. So I don't, midwives, going near to the process of circumcision, midwives deliver babies as well as obstetricians, and so long as as other people are properly trained, properly regulated, and do the neonatal circumcision in appropriate fashion, to me that's what matters over here. And I do think that there is a middle ground on that level. I don't feel that there's a middle ground when we talk about the fact that outsiders are coming along and telling us that the practice of neonatal circumcision is having a prejudicial impact in all sorts of kind of ways on children. I just don't accept that, and I also feel that this absolute responsibility to intervene in the process of neonatal male circumcision is actually a sliding scale on which the scale is being pushed too far towards the responsibility of the state to intervene in the rights of the parents. Every one of us has borderlines about where the state has the right to intervene, and I think this one is going a step too far in that direction.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and I'm joined by the Chief Rabbi in Moscow, Berl Lazar, Professor David Katz, Rabbi Levy of Alyth, and Glen, Poole, and Dr. Antony Lempert. Dr. Lempert, then, I'll come to you. What recommendations would you have?
I think in terms of the recommendations, I think we need to start looking at this from the child's perspective. I think there's far too much discussion about this from the adult religious perspective over and over again, and I can see why it's constantly referred to as an interference by outsiders. I have to say there are many, many people who were insiders who are now on the outside because they don't want to be on the inside. But then, of course, as soon as they change their views, they are then called outsiders. It's a very neat trick to ensure that the voices of those people who disagree are not listened to. And I think it's time we started listening to the voices of children who might not want this procedure. And I really do need to come back on this because I think there's a lot of misinformation and there's also a lot of new information. This is not a minor neonatal operation. Sexual function is something that people cherish and treasure throughout their lives, and they share it with their partners, they share it with themselves. This is something that will affect one person's individual sexual function for the rest of his life. Now, nobody has any business calling that minor or suggesting that other people have any right whatsoever to make that decision on that person's behalf. That is a person from the moment they're born. It is their decision. In terms of meeting in the middle, of course, there should be regulations. It's extraordinary that in this country you don't need a qualification to go and take a knife to the normal genitals of a normal child. I mean, we're living in the 21st century. You can just go ahead and do that. It breaks every single code of child safeguarding. And I appreciate that people always love to go to the middle ground. To me, the middle ground here is the basic, commonly accepted principles of child protection, which are that a normal child's normal body doesn't get operated on for any reason. And I think it's really time that we started looking at this properly from the child's point of view, the child who will be an adult, because they're not always going to be a child, and there are very, very many men harmed psychologically, physically, sexually by this practice. We know this. This is evidence that's in the public domain. We know that 11 boys last year ended up in intensive care unit in one hospital in the UK with serious life-threatening complications from a circumcision they didn't need on their normal body. I feel strongly about this, and I make no objections to that. But I do think we need regulation now to know what's going on and to know how it's happening. And we also need to move forward and protect these children from harm.
If what we say is that religious and cultural reasons are never going to be good enough, then Antony's perspective is just where we're going to be stuck. That's not what I believe. I do believe that people are motivated in this area by good reasons, that they're not doing it in order to harm their children. They're doing it because they are driven by real religious belief, real religious conviction, an understanding that this is religious obligation, a desire to raise their children within a cultural grouping with a cultural identity. I know that for a lot of people there is real ambivalence about that, and there's concern about it, and that it's a hard thing to do. And I think it's unfair to kind of label that as a laissez-faire thing that parents are doing. It's not true. No parent is going out to damage their child. And when we kind of use the immoderate language that we've been hearing just in that last contribution, what that actually does is take us away from the real conversations, which is that how do we enable parents to do this in a way which also minimises risk, which is done in a way which holds them, but also respects their cultural and religious needs as well.
Glen, Poole from the Men's Network. Why do you want to campaign for it to be banned in the UK?
I believe we're living into a future where we'll look back at this time and wonder how on earth we carried on so long performing a painful, dangerous and medically unnecessary surgery without anaesthetic on children's genitals. And I can't stand by and not take action to help all those involved to work towards making that change. And I appreciate it might, for some communities, take small steps rather than large steps, but I'm really committed to having this regulated, reducing the harm it causes, and ultimately reforming our laws and our system so that it stops happening in the future.
Professor Katz, a final word from you.
I'm very struck by the wide range of arguments that are being put together to argue against this practice. The range, just listening to what we've heard, intensive care therapy for those who've recently had, to long-term sexual harm. There's a kind of whole spectrum over there. Which isn't really, to my mind, very helpful, because at the end of the day, we're talking about a religious and cultural obligation where there is a difference of view. And that difference of view about religious and cultural obligations needs to be treated with the same respect as the communities that are involved in this treat the regulation of society and the issues about risk that we've just heard about. I think moving towards an era when we don't have this kind of circumcision is an interesting thought. But at the moment, this is a religion and cultural obligation. And as far as I'm concerned, I hope that this will continue.
I'd like to thank all my guests, Chief Rabbi Moscow Berl Lazar, Professor David Katz, Dr. Antony Lempert, Glen, Poole and Rabbi Levy of Alyth. Thank you all for joining this discussion on the Voice of Russia in London.